I'm so thrilled to be here today to have a conversation with Erica Smiley. Smiley is the executive director of the national organization Jobs with Justice, which brings together labor, communities, students, and faith-based groups and more. And Smiley has been with Jobs with Justice for a long time, previously as organizing director. Smiley has a long history of being a strategist, organizer, writer, thinker, and teacher. She has written for our journal New Labor Forum and has taught a class for us at the School of Labor and Urban Studies, which was wonderful. And Smiley's from North Carolina and started her organizing experience in the South, and today works nationally, but has a special interest and emphasis on organizing the South as a key location. So Smiley, thank you so much for joining us.
No, it's great to be here, Stephanie.
So we have so much exciting to cover. There's so much I want to talk about, but I thought we could start with the latest or one of the newest initiatives that Jobs with Justice has launched, the Advancing Black Strategist Initiative, which I heard about, I guess, last year, and I just, was really excited to hear about it. And in our conversations, you've just raised so many important points about why this is necessary. So I thought maybe you could just explain to the audience what the initiative is and what motivated it.
Yeah, no, for sure. Look, so I love CUNY and particularly the School of Labor and Urban Studies. So it's really an honor to be here and to be able to participate in this. Like you mentioned, I'm originally from North Carolina, and I like to think that I got into this work because I wanted to ensure that the people I grew up around had access to platforms to organize and collectively negotiate in service to ultimately having access to govern themselves and be a part of like a healthy, vibrant democracy. And where I grew up, which I think competes with maybe Puerto Rico for lowest union density in the country, there's not a lot of kind of what we would see as traditional union participation opportunities there. And that's been the way in the southern region for a long time, and arguably has been the kind of a creeping thing throughout the rest of the country. People like to say, as goes the South, so goes the nation, and we begin to see a lot more of that throughout the Midwest with the expansion of right to work for less and the expansion of voter suppression and other limitations to democracy. So that's, I want to say that first, and then there was another reason as well, which was maybe more personal and directed to my experience when I was the organizing director, was that I was attempting to hire an organizer maybe 10 years ago, and didn't have a problem reaching a large pool of organizers of color and Black organizers, which is what I wanted to really try to target. But also when I started interviewing a lot of folks, that realizing that even though many of them had perhaps more years in the field than I did, a lot of particularly the Black organizers I spoke with hadn't actually ever had the ability or the agency to develop strategy. They had, for sometimes 20 years, just been the worker bees, the implementers of someone else's strategy, often someone else who was not Black. And so those were two experiences that shaped both my own orientation into the work, but also shaped or began to catalyze, I should say, this idea of the Advancing Black Strategist Initiative, which is to say that we are clear that we would like to be moving towards building an inclusive multiracial democracy in this country, that can't simply happen just as a political project, although that, voting is very important, but it has to also be an economic project where the majority of people are able to govern the economic relationships surrounding their lives. And that collective bargaining is a pathway towards economic democracy. It's a policy for the workplace. There's a process that everyone has access to. There's grievance, in the where it works best. That's what it is. And so, trying to think through how we at Jobs with Justice can apply the frameworks of collective bargaining to various types of employment relationships in some way or another, as well as other types of economic relationships, housing, landlord debt, banks, Wall Street, you name it. And that would actually get us to democracy. And so if that's kind of where we're trying to go, it's important to look at what's holding us back. And we can't actually move forward and begin to build, not just in this kind of naive Pollyannish kind of way. Like I want to be very clear, we can't actually build that thing strategically without addressing what our current society was designed to do, which is, is built on white supremacy, built on slave labor, built on the labor of my ancestors. And so the Advancing Black Strategist Initiative, this is a very long answer, Stephanie. You should just cut me off if I'm not getting to I'm Southern, right? I can talk for a long time. Okay, sorry. But
it's good.
Okay, good. So the Advancing Black Strategist Initiative is an intervention that Jobs with Justice, in partnership with Morehouse College and the Black Worker Initiative at the Institute for Policy Studies, pulled together and are now in partnership with many others, many different Black leaders at unions, Black strategists in academia, to make 3 interventions. The first one is an intervention in School of Thought to actually support the, International Labor and Comparative Studies department at Morehouse College, which is a historically Black university, a historically Black college in Atlanta, and to through that program to really anchor a school of thought there that says that we have to think about and look at experiments that Black workers are testing in the Southern region, not just as things that are going to be good for those workers, but potentially as things that could be applied to building the labor movement overall, that the people who have longest been in the direct conflict of these different political ideals over the last 200 years, 400 years, and to the people who have an appetite for something new, who have long lost, if they ever had access to 20th century platforms of democracy or of worker power, that can actually imagine something that would work for them, as opposed to just trying to get back to something we had in the glory days of the 50s, depending on what union you belong to. The 50s weren't that glorious for my people, but whatever. Some people felt they were the golden age. So that's the first intervention, and to really elevate that amongst other labor colleges and discourse, not just as a ghettoized kind of, this is what works in the Black South, but actually this is what could be useful in other places. Kind of a counter intervention to, say, applying the Chicago Alinsky models to everywhere else, or the New York models to everywhere else, actually looking at what's working in the Southern region. So that's one intervention. The second one is an apprenticeship program where we're actually trying to support Black worker leaders who've been in the workforce for a while. Maybe they're a steward in their union or have been involved in movement stuff through this, the organization that relates to their workplace or their job, and who wants to actually become more involved in the strategy, who actually, wants to eventually be in a role where they're directing strategy, either as an officer in their union organization or running for office or whatever. We have lots of ideas for where they could be placed, our own 30-year plan for judgeships, but taking those leaders and placing them in apprenticeships in Southern Black-led Southern campaigns that aren't just about passing policy, but are actually about attempting to negotiate with capital in some real way, either through workplace or some other economic channel, which would, of course, then infuse, which is maybe the third intervention, is that it would infuse some resources and capacity for 18 months into those campaigns in a real way, so that we could then, in partnership with the School of Thought, like actually begin to translate, analyze, project some of the learnings from those campaigns in a different way, in a way that's more about what is to be done overall, and not just in a way that's like, here's some cool campaigns happening in the Southern region. So that's what we are attempting to do with the Advancing Black Strategist Initiative. And I guess if I'd be remiss not to say, perhaps the last intervention is actually that we're building up a network of Black strategists, of current Black strategists and aspiring Black strategists throughout different fields, not just movement organizers, but also academics, some small business types who are thinking about this, journalists, people who could potentially be in positions where having an orientation around collective bargaining as a pathway to democracy and having an orientation around the role of Black workers in the South could eventually matter. And so, it's not a good old boys club. It's the opposite, but kind of serves the same purpose in lots of different ways in building up our network so that we can actually support the leaders that ultimately come through either the university or the apprenticeship program.
It's so exciting. And I think a lot of our students at CUNY would be really excited about engaging. I wanted to follow up on a couple of threads. One is like this notion, you said that you talked to all these Black organizers who were never trained and mentored in strategy. And I think that's part of the legacy of the labor movement's, history of discrimination, of top-down, leadership, of bringing on organizers, but not bringing them into the room fully. But also, I think just a lack of strategy in the labor movement in general, like strategy tends to be very short term, like focus on the next contract or even the next election, getting, the mayor elected. And so I'm wondering if you have thoughts, more about like how is there a goal? You said there's no golden period, but how ideally strategy is developed and how do we get to the labor movement more generally thinking about strategy and particularly Black organizers and leaders?
Yeah, that's a fun question, Stephanie. I'm like, yes, there's all kinds of stuff in there. I'm like, I'm not going to trip on that one. All right, so here's a couple of reactions. One is that I think that it's important for us to distinguish between movements and institutions. And I know this is even taught in a couple classes at CUNY where, you've got movements that are huge, messy, a little more spontaneous, and movements win things. They agitate and they win things. And then you have institutions that essentially implement and maintain the victories that the movements won. And so oftentimes we use the labor movement and organized labor kind of interchangeably, when in fact we should really clarify the institutions who are implementing 20th century victories versus the movements who are trying to imagine 21st century victories that we need, and potentially, either adapting existing institutions or building new ones to then defend those victories. So that's an abstract way of really trying to clarify the dynamic of who sets strategy when and where, because in some sense, it makes sense, right? Like if you look at a traditional union, we would think it's short-sighted, but of course they're thinking about the next election, and of course they're trying to make sure that they have they get a better contract in the next round than they got in the last round, and all the things that entails, and that's good. But we also have to be, investing in both as institutions defending those past victories as well as the movements who are trying to build these future fight. We have to be investing in that fight in strategic ways. And so anyway, that's obviously going to be very messy, but I think that there's the reason why it's important to separate those is that the leaders of the movements should have different strategies that aren't just getting to a contract or getting to yes, as the book says, right? That are actually about imagining the future of what we're trying to build, imagining what the future union is actually winning and representing, imagining different types of collective bargaining agreements with different types of people or different employers, given the changing nature of our global economy. So I think that there's a lot of talent in our current institutions that we should really apply to that thought development, to that process. But I think there's, perhaps even more exciting is the level of talent that's in kind of a broader movement. Let's just take the case of Bessemer right now, where a majority of the workers in that Amazon plant are Black. I think it's like 85% were the numbers that I saw. In Alabama, they called the union in to support, like they organized the union. It wasn't like a part of some kind of scheme and like long-term plan. And they called the union in the period surrounding the murder of George Floyd. and the uprisings over the summer. So these are people who were perhaps like thinking about some of the stuff they've been dealing with at work, but were activated in a movement context to take different types of action, right? Now, luckily, the union, they called in this case, was ready for that. And is, and they're now in an election. But, this in some ways follows so many stories. If you look at the sanitation workers or the shipyard fights in Virginia, right? Like where Southern Black workers are in many ways more ready to try this and strategize than our institutions are. They get pulled in kind of kicking and screaming, and the best of them show up and some of them don't, right? But and yet, it's hard to get people to invest real long-term presence and strategy in the Southern region, despite it. So there's, while institutions and movements have symbiotic relationships, oftentimes the institutions feel like it's not worth doing unless they're leading or they called it or they set it up. But we have a base in the region, like my people in the South, Black people are saying, we're ready to go to bat. We know we're going to get our asses kicked. We've gotten them before. We know what that feels like, but we have to keep fighting, and we need you with us. We need your resources. We need your people. And so I think making sure that we're giving what resources are not in the region already, make sure that we're putting some resources and infrastructure there to support those leaders becoming the strategists, as opposed to just bringing strategists in to tell them what to do. I think that's the subtle thing that we're hoping to tweak when it comes to the Advancing Black Strategists initiative.
That's great. And since you brought up Amazon, it's I figure I just go on that a bit here. There's this funny tension going on right now between this idea of a boycott that's been called not by the workers or by the union, but a lot of community people, shoppers and so forth, wanting to support the campaign. So how do we balance this kind of letting the workers lead, developing the workers as the strategists of the campaign, but then also thinking of this as all of our fight? This is a big fight that involves everyone. And, how do you balance those tensions?
Yeah, it's really just a question of strategy and tactics. So we all agree we want the workers to lead in the strategy and tactics, even if someone disagrees with them, they should lead because it's their fight. And so in that sense, taking leadership from those workers is critical. And if they aren't calling a boycott, we shouldn't boycott. Second, you're right, though, there is this tension because it is all of our fights. If this is victorious, it'd be similar to some of the initial victories within the auto industry, where it then changes the landscape for working people far beyond Amazon and far beyond e-commerce in that industry, right? It actually creates a very different floor. And so we want to we have a stake in it in a very different way. And so I think the question then becomes what are the ways that we outside of Bessemer, Alabama can elevate and support and position the fight of these workers as a fight that's for all of us? And what are the tactics that allow us to do that in a way that doesn't actually hurt them, right? Or doesn't hurt the workers, but perhaps gets the company's attention. And as much as I always love the idea of a boycott, I think those of us who've organized for a long time know that certain conditions have to be in place for a boycott. And for a company like Amazon, to really impact their bottom line, we don't have those conditions in place. So that would only hurt the workers. It would not hurt the company. And we're in a pandemic. And the idea of people who might be dependent on the company for their groceries boycotting feels like a hard ask. It's like boycotting the ER when you're sick. That said, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't make demands on the company as consumers, as Prime members, or whatever it is, about what their behavior and practices are in order to maintain our status or our business, or in order, even in terms of our shopping practices themselves, in terms of going to directly to some of the vendors as opposed to through Amazon and that kind of thing. So, and that's something that we as a movement have to try to navigate in conversation with the workers themselves. The other thing, which I know we've been thinking a lot about at Jobs with Justice, is the elevating the contradictions or the crimes of the employer, while simultaneously positioning these workers as kind of the frontline heroes of the struggle for democracy in this moment. And so, you know, there's a lot of discourse that we need to shape, whether they win or lose, that really clarifies the struggle as one of not just workers' rights, but one of actually defending and trying to promote and expand democracy and democratic practices. You know, we have a company that was you know, battling the Trump administration when it came to, you know, promoting mail-in ballots during the election and saying everyone should be able to vote, and was super down when it came to the politics of democracy, and a company that changed all of its headers to show that they supported Black lives after George Floyd and all this stuff, and was super woke on social media. And I'm sure that the Black workers in their plants saw that and felt like, oh, okay, well, we could show you how to really be woke, is actually to respect Black people right here, like right in your backyard. And so you got this company that apparently went from being like way woke to then using the talking points of the Trump administration and like the authoritarian segments of like the radical right to say that there shouldn't be mail-in ballots when it comes to the union election. No, we got to go back to the sanctity of secret ballots when it comes to that. So, you know, I think a lot of us can kind of point to that contradiction and really clarify for each other that this is actually a point of battle, a point of struggle for our democracy, not just a workers' rights campaign that we should be in solidarity with for some moral reason, but actually, you know, our ability to participate beyond this is at stake, and we need them to win for that reason.
Yeah, it makes me think about some of the northern manufacturers during before the Civil War, who were abolitionists on paper, but then were making their profit.
Oh yeah, you said it, Stephanie. It's true. I mean, and in Bessemer, the people where they, you know, they were abolitionists on paper. They you know, transitioning people from slave labor to wage labor in their shops, and some not even wage labor. You know, I mean, the whole Jim Crow and the truancy laws to basically, you know, put prison labor in the mines or in the steel mill. I mean, it's just really just a matter of who is benefiting from Black labor, and that's, you know, I think to be really clear in this moment about who is benefiting from the pandemic, who's benefiting from paying low wages, who's benefiting from the precarity of Black workers is now becoming more front and center, and Amazon being kind of the star of the show in this moment.
Yeah, sure. And so that makes me think a lot about what you've written and talked about in terms of our strategy of, you know, we never had complete democracy in this country. We had, you know, a period of Reconstruction that was, you know, brutally crushed. And, you know, how do we, like the labor movement, sometimes our unions tend to be conservative in the sense of not addressing issues they think might be controversial. Some unions want to just talk about the wage, just talk about the contract, and not talk about racial justice or racial capitalism, because that might divide the workers. And so can you say a bit more about that? Your thinking on the necessity for centering racial justice as part of our demand for democracy, as part of our demand for the labor movement?
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out the right way to word this, but, you know, first question is we have to think about who is the labor movement of the future. You know, I don't know that, I don't know, like, I don't know that Gompers imagined me as a labor leader, but someone did. Someone had a science fiction strategy that included you and me as the labor movement of the future. And so in our task as movement people, we have to think about who is the labor movement of the future? Who are the labor leaders of the future? What do they look like? What do they do? And at the same time, to do that well, we have to, in the whole Ghanaian tradition, looking at the Sankofa, we also have to look at our history and make sure that we're articulating who the labor movement of the past was as well. You know, one of my favorite books of recent recent. I mean, I have a lot of favorites, but whatever. I'm just going to pick this one now. Eric Loomis's History of the U.S. and 10 Strikes, right? And he has that great quote from W.B. Du Bois, which is like an earlier favorite with Black Reconstruction, where he says like the biggest strike in American history was when 500,000 Black people walked off the plantations, And I think that re-looking at our history through the lens of race shows a very robust and active labor movement amongst Black people and migrant people and women, right? So like the Atlanta washerwomen story is another great one, like the Chinese rail workers, or the Latino migrant farm workers. I mean, we have like this great, robust, diverse, multiracial labor history. And yet, when most people think of unions, they see this big, muscly white dude with like a hammer or some kind of tool or pickaxe or whatever it is. And even including me, including people like us, right? And so to some degree, there's a bit of a reorientation we need to have, because the majority of workers in this country are women, and many, right, are like people of color and Black people. And there was a moment, I think, under the Obama administration, people were like, well, majority, minority, so then all the politics are going to just inevitably change. But like those of us who grew up in the South have always known that the minority never needs like permission to rule. I mean, like, you got situations where black workers who were enslaved were the majority in places like South Carolina that's why they created these laws, to keep the majority from ruling. And so we have to, labor leaders, particularly union leaders, I think that's a hard thing to grapple with, because you've built power based on this previous system, and that power is useful, and you can leverage it. But in order to build power for what will inevitably be a future system of things, you might have to make some serious adaptations and look at the population of your sector differently. I think one great example of a union that is trying to do this is with the painters union, with President Ken Rigmaiden, who's like, I think the sole Black building trades president right now. Maybe, I don't know if he's the first, but still one of them at least. And, it's really clear that the use of migrant labor in their workforce has increased exponentially over the last couple of decades, and that, not only is it the right thing to do, but they will disappear as a union if they don't have a strategy that addresses the new work relationships that these more precarious labor forces are being forced into, instead of blaming them for stealing jobs. And so having like a real strategy in cities like Nashville and Houston and Denver to like take that on is actually an example of an institution that is both trying to take care of the needs of its current workers while also imagining what their union needs to be in the future. And so that's kind of the orientation that I think most of us have to have, is to really try to spend some time imagining what our future movement would be if we were to get to 90% union density in this country. Unions will have to look very different than how they look now.
Yeah. Well, can you say more about their strategy? I mean, in terms of like, it's thinking about the future workforce, the future members, but it also, I imagine, involves perhaps education with current members and spaces for political education and dialogue and debate with the current membership.
Yeah, it involves education, but also shifts in strategy. So certainly we've been working with them, and they've been working with others to develop internal trainings and tools and political education to support their own organizers and worker leaders in recruiting and retention amongst the new workforce, mostly migrant women workforce. So, that involves not just like understanding who they are or learning to speak the language that they speak, but also being aware of the situation or the circumstances that brought them into the field. So that's one. So that is definitely a piece of it, that level of political education. The other piece of it is actually thinking about strategy differently, that in order to get, let's say, like this with the building trades, right? We're looking at marketplace power. We're looking at trying to control the skill sets in an area, and then using that to negotiate through a hiring hall. That may still work in some places, But depending on how the companies themselves and the contractors themselves are reorganizing, it might actually require a different type of campaign. Maybe it's a corporate campaign, or maybe it's prioritizing a set of relief for immigrant workers so that they can be protected under existing labor law, or imagining new labor law that would protect them, right? Like, so in addition to what some might be thinking about around the PRO Act, we might also need to be thinking about, the Power Act that would allow, that would basically be a fix for the Hoffman Plastic case and allow undocumented workers protection under the law. Or even in small like fights like around wage theft, instead of just trying to win back wages for a set of workers, actually trying to figure out how we criminalize, criminalize the behavior of the employer or the contractor, and decriminalize the behavior or existence of the workers themselves. Like that actually, those then become central to any organizing drive that they would have in any given region. And so those are just like the types of strategies that I feel like are good examples of attempts. And to be fair, they're going to be imperfect because those are movement strategies and they're messy AF. Like, there isn't just like you go to the contractor and sign whatever, like a prevailing wage agreement and move on. No, they're nasty. And so, but to get into that muck is actually what's required for us to start like giving birth to this new labor movement into the kind of the 21st century union movement.
Sorry, I had some honking going on, double parking.
Oh, good.
So you're emphasizing use of more movement strategies, being more creative, taking risks, combined with some of the traditional union strategies for building power in the workplace and so forth. You haven't said as much so far about like electoral power and political power in that traditional way. How do you see that fitting in? And particularly when we're talking about the South and the big role that we saw Georgia play in the last election. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, tons of thoughts. I mean, I'm not necessarily just in full disclaimer, like I'm not necessarily the person that's thinking most about the political strategy. And there are a lot of really good and smart people like Stacey Abrams and Tamika Atkins, who are like thinking through these types of things around not only how to maximize participation under our current systems, but how to change those systems to allow for more equitable democratic participation. And then, of course, there are people on the other side of that who are actively trying to suppress it. I mean, just like the bills that passed in the last week in Georgia, Lord help us. I mean, people are straight up trying to go back to some kind of Jim Crow era voting practices, right? So I want to just like put that out there. In my view, there are two sides of the same coin, that you can't actually have a healthy multiracial democracy without the other. They both necessitate each other. If we define, and I should say I define democracy as the majority of people being able to participate in directly governing, enforcing, changing the rules around them, whether that's in the context of a workplace through a collective bargaining agreement or through policies and rules that govern their society or their community, then that has to happen everywhere, right? Like it's not just voting once a year that accomplishes that, although that's very important, obviously. I think that so that's one comment. The other reaction to the question is just that I think that our movement has put so much emphasis on political democracy. Like that was always the thing that seemed like democracy light. It's like, even if you look at Reconstruction, like a lot of focus was on the political democracy and voting, and like the big abolitionist companies were okay with that. They weren't okay with the union, but they were okay with everyone maybe voting or having some kind of say or representative. And Amazon is a great example, like okay with like mail-in ballots when it comes to the political stuff, but not necessarily when it comes to the union election. And so the intervention that we attempt to make in Jobs with Justice is actually to clarify that we have to have a similar strategy and approach towards economic democracy and participation, and that we have power there. So certainly like power in numbers is the easiest for any good American activist to understand. That's like, so many stories about when we turned out enough people to vote, or turned out enough people to shut down a facility, or turned out enough people to boycott. And that's a really important power. It's also not the only power we have. And in fact, in the labor movement today and historically, we have very clear understanding of that sometimes you only need a couple of people in a very strategic place to have power, or you need, to control, as in the case with construction trades, the skill set of a population in a particular geography, that actually gives you leverage and power. And so, I think that it's really important to continue to fight for democracy politically as like the bare minimum, but that in order to get past this, in order to prevent, ourselves from losing that, we also have to have a robust strategy for kind of a worker-centered economic democracy in this country. And that would actually, we're fighting the same people, in essence, the same people who are trying to take away our political democracy, or have also been trying to keep us from voting in many instances, Georgia being a great example just this past week. So that's actually a part of the fight that we have to prioritize as a movement, as a progressive movement, not just as a labor movement, because not doing so will kind of ensure our defeat.
Right. That's a lot to think about and process.
You asked the question, Stephanie.
Yeah, that's true. And now I'm going to actually move to letting the audience ask some of the questions, which from the looks of it, are even harder. So,
oh boy.
So our first question comes in saying the monopolies today appear bigger and more complex than the past. How do we in the current climate fight for racial justice in the worldwide monopolies of today?
Great. So I have the answers to all of these questions. After this is over, we're just going to go out and do this, right?
Yes, right. We need a 3-step program.
Yeah. So for all of these questions, imagine whatever I say being prefaced with, I don't really know, but I do think that, so monopolies are clearly a huge problem, Amazon being a great example, but also Google and other tech giants, and now the growing gig companies. So, I think that there's a question, and this is like a movement, those of us who are able to, and maybe privileged enough to be a part of these debates, is there's a question about whether or not you break them up, and if so, how, right? Because you don't want to break up a company in a way that makes them even harder to organize, or even harder to like hold accountable. We don't want to like catalyze our own fissuring necessarily, but is there a way to break them up that makes it easier to regulate, hold them accountable, or even in some instances really kind of control like their practices? And then there's another school of thought, which is, do we keep the infrastructure? Walmart's a great example of this, where they actually have a great infrastructure for, they can predict when toothpaste is going to be out so that it's never out. They fill it right away, right? There are certain systems that could be useful if they were under our control. And so the other school of thought is, do we figure out how we actually begin to insert more and more of our control in some of these companies? And so that's one debate that I'm not even going to try to pretend like I'm not going to share my opinion on that, because I don't want to be on Tumblr being attacked or whatever it is. But I think that's part of the debate. And then, what then comes of that? What then comes of that is this question of like when to then try each, right? So, we've had hearings in Congress, have hearings coming up even in the next couple of weeks to try to navigate the monopoly rules around Amazon. Like, we could do some minor reforms here and there, but there are some moments when we could potentially have more leverage. So when a monopoly has large government contracts, or when monopoly, like under the, the 2008 bailout of the auto industry, when they start to get a huge infusion of tax dollars, what does that mean in terms of our ability to then rule them? Do we now own half the company as a society? Do we get to vote on how their practices? Do we elect half the board then, and like get to make a different set of decisions? We haven't necessarily as a movement been good at making those demands in those moments. And I think, you know, we are getting a little better, and certainly COVID allowed us to speed up our attempts, particularly when it came to the tourism and more specifically the airline industry, around what it means to get an infusion of our funds, keeping people on payroll, what's required. And that is not just about sticking one person on a corporate board, but actually navigating how we then have a share of it, or you know, like a strong percentage, maybe even a controlling share of a board if we're infusing that kind of money. So, you know, without going too far down the line of socialism, which I'm sure you know, would be its own strategy in conflict, I do think that those are the fundamental questions about some of these big multinational, transnational monopolies, is like how much to like break them up and just return them to some kind of semblance of what we're used to from the 20th century, versus how much do we try to actually control their practices and benefit from whatever innovations they've made.
Yeah. It's crazy because it feels like, you know, what we're in is the worst of both worlds. It's like we have these massive monopolies that benefit for themselves, and we're not really getting the benefits as society. And yeah.
Right. They've totally like socialized the risk and privatized all the benefit. I mean, the pandemic, there's a great, I'll try to put in the chat, a report on all the pandemic profiteering from the last year and how much these people made off of our struggling, off of our suffering.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. And, you know, it's an interesting one to me because I feel like all of those folks, you know, on the other side of the political spectrum, who are technically, you know, pro-market, pro-free trade and so forth. I mean, Adam Smith hated the idea of monopolies. Like, this is not something that is even, you know, compatible with traditional, you know, neoclassical or classical economics.
That's right. This is not Adam Smith's democracy. This is not Tocqueville's democracy. Right. Never thought we'd be quoting them on a CUNY call, Stephanie. You went there.
Yeah, this is a okay, so we have another audience question, which is also challenging. How can movements handle the tension between imagining strategies without alienating institutions whose resources and support are so important?
Without doing what? I missed that part.
Alienating the institutions whose resources and support are so important. And if the right strategy means moving towards new institutions or new leadership at existing institutions, do movements have to hide their strategy to an extent, you know? So does this make sense? I think, you know, wondering, like, thinking big and strategizing may be a real threat to existing leaders or existing organizations.
Yeah, it is. I mean, sometimes it just is. I don't know. I don't know that there's, I mean, this is part of what I mean when I say that it's messy, is that there will inevitably be moments when an institutional leader or an institution themselves is isolated because of a movement thing. And I think that sometimes that's even a good thing to have that tension, because it creates, you know, not to go down the road of dialectical materialism, but it creates a conflict that could actually change things in a really good way. And so in some ways you kind of want movements to agitate and to push in ways that are hard. Great example from over the summer. So when the movement for Black Lives began to push pretty strongly for abolishing police, and that was hard. It still is, right? Especially for some of the unions who have police in their ranks. And some of them, it actually pushed them to really like have hard discussions within their own memberships and to make decisions about if that small percentage of police that they represented was going to drive the, you know, the values of the union as a whole. And that's a good thing, right? And some of it also allowed us to start thinking about policing differently, such that it wasn't just about abolishing police, but actually thinking about how policing is reorganized in a way that actually does protect our communities and not just property owners or whatever, right? And then certainly, like, it's not just racist. So and that was never, this demand of abolishing the police was never ever going to come from institutions. And so I guess, like, I don't know if I'm responding to the question well enough, but I guess my reaction is just that there will always be tension. Sometimes there should be tension. And that's partially why we have to be clear about the role of movements versus the role of institutions. And when we're not clear on it, then let's say in my role as an institutional leader at J, if I wasn't clear on that, I would be frustrated every time somebody agitated on a demand like abolishing the police that I knew was going to piss off elements of the stakeholders in the base that I represent. But because I'm clear that there's a role for that, right? Like then I can play my own role in trying to navigate what that means and how we might need to shift or otherwise, right? So I guess I'll just stop there. That's kind of my reaction to that. No, I don't think movements need to hide strategy insofar as like, we hide strategy from our opposition so that they don't know we're coming. But I don't know that, institutions, I don't think should try to shut down movements, and movement should also understand the interests of institutions.
Yeah. And it makes me think, in addition to this past summer, moments like Occupy Wall Street or the teachers' strikes, when they were, a lot of rank and file union members were just stepping out and saying, leaders, follow us, and the good leaders knew to follow, right? So they were like, this is a space where the membership's going to lead us into new territory.
Right, that's right.
Okay, so we have a question here. Could you share some stories about what's working in the South to organize Black workers? Where are good examples of folks organizing, figuring out the unique challenges of the South, and winning or building momentum to winning? I'd love to hear more about your work on the ground that's inspiring you.
Oh, yeah, I like this question. So I've been really, so again, I'm from North Carolina, right? And let me preface this, because the fights that I list are going to be slightly different, right? But let me preface this by saying that I like to think about this question of scale very differently than it's sometimes talked about in more dominant culture and conversations, like power of numbers kind of thing. Because I actually think that the way that scale has worked in the Southern region is through this idea of a kind of these flashpoint campaigns that immediately, even if they only impact a small number of workers, reshape what's possible in a way that more people then take up different fights, whether it's in the same sector or not, right? And so the fights that I'm going to mention are kind of based on that, right? And another good book, by the way, because there's no way I'm going to get to all the case studies, but Lane Wyndham's Knocking on Labor's Door. Holy cow. Like it was like so validating to read it. It was like all these Black workers and women workers and migrant workers, particularly in Southern campaigns, who have been like fighting like hell in the 70s and 80s, which most labor historians will refer to as like the lost years. And like, meanwhile, like my people are like scrapping, right? Like trying to win. So anyway, so I was super inspired by that book of case studies of great campaigns, from auto workers to shipyard workers to whatever, textile workers in my state. Highly recommend Knocking on Labor's Door. Okay, so one of the fights that's in Knocking on Labor's Door, and is also the one that inspired me to do this work, is the struggle of Kmart workers in Greensboro, North Carolina, which is where I'm from. And that was a fight in the mid-90s. I was like still a teenager. I was organized by my church to be a part of this local struggle and community solidarity. I remember a couple of the pastors getting arrested at an event at one of the executives' offices, or whatever, near their homes. It was a golf course. That's all I remember. And I'd never been on one of those. Anyway, the long and short is that I didn't know it was a union fight. I didn't know they were trying to win a contract with Act Two. I just knew that these were Black women who had faced serious discrimination in employment practices, and some of whom went to the church, right? And we were there to back them up. And so I actually think, so that one lesson I've kind of captured from that is that how we frame these fights can't always just be come support a union drive. That's not actually what people are, that's not the first thing they're seeing. That's not the thing that's necessarily motivating them to be getting arrested on behalf of workers in their congregation. And to really lean into that in a way that is not just the wage issues, but like, what is it that workers are really experiencing as whole people? And I think we've seen similar things even in Bessemer in Alabama, where even though that's perhaps a more traditional union election, the way that those workers were radicalized wasn't necessarily through just the traditional knocking on doors, talking about wages, talking about the boss, but but actually radicalized through the experience of how Black people have been treated over the past few years, culminating in the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, right, et cetera. So that's one great example. All right, another one, which I would argue is a great flashpoint, was in 2012 in Atlanta, which was like the Justice for School Workers campaign. You've got these mostly women, mostly Black women, working in different service jobs within different universities and charter schools, food service, food courts. Imagine that those are the types, some bus drivers, but really mostly food service workers, who these jobs that had once been great, sustainable, year-long jobs, some of them even public sector jobs, over the years have been turned into seasonal work where they were laid off every summer and had to reapply for their job in the fall, and thus were dependent on unemployment. And the state DOL commissioner at the time, Mark Butler, decided they were scamming the system. Many of us have heard of this whole unemployment scams that the right tries to put on us. That's been disproven over and over again, but they still come with it. And so it could have easily been a campaign where it was just like, a community fight where women were trying to get their unemployment benefits again. And we've seen those, and some of those are successful. That's great. But the cool thing about this fight is they organized as workers. They created the sector of school workers, justice for school workers, and organized for the unemployment benefits as back wages. Like, you owe us this money. Like, this is a part of the business model of how you've set this up. You either need to bring us back on like as full-time employees, or you need to give us that money. And they won that $8 million back through a series of different actions. Some of them ended up in unions, particularly in SEIU, and I think a couple of bus drivers were in the Teamsters, but not all of them did. But there was enough of a container, like they still saw themselves as school workers in the city, right? And are still kind of thinking of themselves as a sector organizing in that way. So that's a very creative way that doesn't necessarily look like a traditional union drive for all of them. Some of them it did, but not for all of them. And that where they were able to win and could actually then be a model for other places. The last one that I'll share, well, whatever. There's so many good ones, right? I mean, there's like I said, I'm from North Carolina, right? But like I grew up around the UE, right? The mighty UE, and or like the United Campus Workers, CWA in Tennessee, where they've taken a completely different spin on minority unionism, where it's like illegal for public sector workers to organize, and are actually like trying to almost like collectively bargain with the state, like they take on these fights. And it's not just about winning a majority of people signed up on authorization cards, but like, building with what they have and then taking it into using like a community-based strategy to take on a set of employers in the state and treating that like a public negotiation. I mean, I just think that stuff is brilliant, and we need more of it, and we need to like invest in it and resource that more and more, because like that creates a floor and a pathway for us to win other things, even at the enterprise level. But the last one I was going to say is actually not so much of Black workers, but of guest workers in Louisiana, in Breaux Bridge, Louisiana. So not even talking about Baton Rouge or New Orleans. We're talking like tiny ass shrimper town. And when the Guest Worker Alliance organized, it's not a lot of workers, like 40 workers from the particular community in Mexico, seasonal, came every year. We're getting completely exploited, living in work camps on the site, fainting into the shrimp boiling pots, right? So, and we're being threatened by the employer. And so, but, instead of just like taking that fight up with that local employer, I think it was CJ Seafood or whatever, recognize that the power structure, the employment structure was with their biggest buyer, was with Walmart and Sam's Club. And so you think of a small number, because at the end of the day, it was really only like 13 of them that were willing to like stand up, right? So small number, hyper vulnerable, hyper precarious workers from the small community in Mexico do not have protection under labor law, were able to get a meeting with Walmart. Why? Because of how they set up their strategy. They didn't just try to do a traditional drive on CJs. They actually looked at the ultimate profiteer and created a campaign strategy around that. And it wasn't just a corporate campaign, right? It was actually a campaign to try to negotiate a change in conditions and how suppliers within Walmart's seafood supply chain treated and dealt with workers, and how many guest workers they had, and what the conditions of or should be for those guest workers, and started even thinking about how they might negotiate along different chains of migration. So again, that's not like the 10,000 workers all of a sudden have a union, but that is a huge lesson on how we could scale that strategy far beyond Breaux Bridge, Louisiana, and something that I think we could take a lot of lessons for. So anyway, I could go on, but those are some of the things that I feel most excited about.
That's fantastic. And I think as we are wrapping up our hour, that might be, you know, really inspirational place to end. You know, I feel like I've known you for a while. We've been through a lot of ups and downs in the movements. This feels like a real important, crucial moment. Like this is, you know, it's been going on for a decade, but really building to this space where we can really go in a really bad direction, a really terrible place, or we can build really something different. And I think that, you know, you give us a lot of hope and inspiration that it could be something different. And maybe I'll just ask you one last thought is like, what keeps you, you know, what keeps you going each day? I mean, this is a struggle. Like what gets you up in the morning for the fight?
Oh, it's the same thing that's gotten me up in the morning for the last 40 plus years. It's trying to get to a place where the victories that I'm a part of supporting and winning have real meaningful impact on the people I grew up around in my family, in my community. If winning means I still go home to a family reunion to see people in the same situation, then I haven't really won yet. When winning means that, you know, I can look back and actually feel like I improved the lives of my people, particularly Black American people, particularly Southern Black American people, then I can feel satisfied at my own contribution to the movement. And maybe the last point I'll make, and because a mentor of mine shared this with me, and I like to share it pretty much everywhere I can, is that, you know, all of us, everyone on this call has a task in front of us that may seem amorphous or even like kind of wishy-washy, but it's actually a critical, fundamental task of this moment. And that is, we have to take real time to reimagine a democracy worth fighting for. Because right now, what we are projecting, you know, we're really good at talking about the problem. For those who are talking about getting back to a thing, including using phrases like New Deal and the New Deal or whatever, aren't necessarily capturing they aren't really capturing an imagination of something that could work for all of us, including some people, some working class white people who should technically be with us and aren't, because we aren't painting a future that they can see themselves in. And so we have a huge task ahead of us to do that, and to do it in a way that's not just critical of what currently exists, but actually begins to step back and imagine what could be, and then build a strategy towards that.
All right, thank you so much. This is a beautiful vision, and it will help me also keep going. And I thank you so much for your work.
Stephanie.
And you've done so much for us at SLU, at CUNY, but also the global movement. And we really appreciate your work, and we hope to see you again soon.
I appreciate your work. Look, the amplifier of one of the original Flashpoint campaigns with the living wage, you know, before that framework was even, you know, popular. So I'm honored to be here, Stephanie.
It's been so great to talk to you, and we'll see you soon.
Sounds good.
All right, take care.